He didn't look like the devil. He just looked cold, bleeding out on a wet park bench in a $3,000 suit. Chloe was 26, practically drowning in student debt, and holding half a stale pastrami sandwich. She didn't know he was Gabriel Rossi, the man who owned half the city's underground. She just saw a guy who looked hungrier than she was. So, she handed over her lunch. That was her first mistake, or maybe her only salvation. The public library on 4th and Main didn't smell like magic or endless possibilities. It smelled like decaying glue, wet wool, and desperation. Chloe sat behind the circulation desk, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The heating had died sometime around Tuesday, and by Friday, the cold had settled into the marrow of her bones. She was bundled in a thick, oversized cardigan that hid the curves she had spent half her life apologizing for, and the other half trying to dress on a budget that barely covered utilities. Her bank account sat at a precise, mocking $42. Payday was 4 days away. The math was simple, and it was brutal. You look like you're calculating the exact velocity required to throw yourself out a window, Chloe. She'd looked up. Mrs. Higgins was leaning over the counter, clutching a stack of worn mystery paperbacks. "Just budgeting, Mrs. Higgins," Chloe said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her tired eyes. She scanned the books. The scanner gave a weak, electronic wheeze. "Though the window is looking tempting." Mrs. Higgins patted Chloe's hand. Her skin felt like dry parchment. "You work too hard, dear. Go take your lunch. You look pale." Chloe didn't have the heart to tell her that her lunch consisted of a singular, depressed pastrami sandwich on discount rye bread. She grabbed her coat, a thrift store find that smelled perpetually of mothballs, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the November chill. The city was unforgiving. It was spitting a fine, icy mist that clung to everything. She walked 2 blocks to the small concrete plaza, tucked between a defunct bank and a towering office building. It was her usual spot. Quiet. Mostly empty. Today it wasn't empty. A man was sitting on her bench. She stopped. She didn't want to turn around. Her feet hurt, her boots were leaking, and she was too hungry to surrender her quiet 30 minutes. She approached slowly, pulling the foil-wrapped sandwich from her pocket. He was slumped forward, elbows resting on his knees. He wore a dark charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision that cost more than her annual salary. His overcoat was soaked through. Dark hair, wet and plastered to a strong, sharp forehead. As she got closer, she saw the dark stain spreading across his ribs. It wasn't rain. It was thick, blackish red in the grey afternoon light. Chloe froze. Every survival instinct honed by living in a rough city screamed at her to turn around and walk away. Don't look. Don't engage. But then he lifted his head. His eyes were a pale, striking grey. They were entirely void of panic. He didn't look like a man bleeding out in a public park. He looked like a man who was inconvenienced by the fact. He looked at her. Then he looked at the silver foil in her hand. His chest hitched, a sharp intake of breath that betrayed his calm facade. A tremor ran through his hands. "You're bleeding," Chloe said. It was a stupid, obvious thing to say. "Perceptive," he rasped. His voice was gravel and smoke. He leaned back against the wet wooden slats, wincing. "Don't scream. Don't call a fucking ambulance. Just give me a minute." She stood there, water dripping from her fraying scarf. She should have run. She should have called the police. But looking at him, she didn't see a threat. She saw exhaustion. A bone-deep, crushing exhaustion that she recognized every time she looked in the mirror. Her stomach growled, a loud, obnoxious sound in the quiet plaza. He blinked, a flicker of dark amusement crossing his pale face. Chloe looked at the foil in her hand. Half a pastrami sandwich, $42 in the bank, 4 days until payday. She unwrapped it. The bread was slightly damp, the meat looking sad and grey. She stepped forward and held it out. He stared at the sandwich, then up at her. The amusement vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating stare. "What is that?" "Lunch," Chloe said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You look like you're going to pass out. Sugar and salt help with shock, or so I read. I'm a librarian. I'm bleeding from a stab wound, sweetheart, not suffering from low blood sugar. Suit yourself." She didn't pull her hand back. "It's pastrami. It's terrible, but it's calories." He studied her face. He took in the cheap coat, the wet hair, the dark circles under her eyes. He reached out. His hand was large, the knuckles bruised, a heavy gold ring on his right index finger. His fingers brushed hers. They were freezing. He took the sandwich. He didn't say thank you. He just took a bite, chewing slowly, his grey eyes never leaving hers. Chloe turned around and walked back to the library in the rain, her stomach hollow, wondering why the hell she had just given her last meal to a dying man in a bespoke suit. The hunger headache hit around 3 in the afternoon, a dull, pulsing throb at the base of her skull. She pushed a cart of returns through the biography section, the squeaking wheels echoing in the quiet room. She tried not to think about the man on the bench. She tried not to think about the blood. By the time her shift ended at 7, the rain had turned to sleet. She walked the 6 blocks to her apartment, head down, shoulders hunched. The hallway of her building smelled of stale cigarettes and boiled cabbage. When she reached her door, a yellow piece of paper was taped directly over the peephole. Notice of eviction. Chloe pulled it down. The paper felt heavy in her numb fingers. She had 30 days. 30 days to come up with 3 months of back rent she didn't have. She unlocked the door, stepped into the dark apartment, and slid down the door until she hit the floor. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had the energy for it. She just sat there in the dark, listening to the radiator clank, wondering if sleeping in the library basement was a viable option. The weekend passed in a blur of cheap ramen and frantic, useless math. She picked up an extra shift at a local diner on Sunday, enduring the leers of the kitchen staff and the aching in her calves for $50 in tips. It was a drop in the ocean. Tuesday morning, the library was unusually quiet. The director, a nervous man named Davis, had called a staff meeting. He stood at the front of the break room, wringing his hands. "The city council met last night," Davis said, his voice thin. "Funding has been slashed. We're cutting hours. And we'll have to let 2 of the part-time staff go." He didn't look at Chloe, but he didn't have to. She was the newest hire. She was the most expendable. She went back to the circulation desk feeling like she was moving underwater. The eviction. The job. It was all crumbling. At noon, the heavy glass doors of the library opened. It wasn't Mrs. Higgins. It wasn't the usual crowd of college students or unhoused locals looking for warmth. 3 men walked in. They moved with a terrifying synchronization. They wore dark, tailored overcoats over dark suits. They didn't look at the books. They scanned the room, their eyes cold and professional. The ambient noise in the library seemed to die instantly. People shrunk back into the aisles. The man in the center, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, walked straight to the circulation desk. Jimmy, the elderly security guard, started to step forward, his hand trembling near his walkie-talkie. The man simply looked at Jimmy, a flat, dead stare, and Jimmy froze. The man stopped in front of Chloe. Up close, he smelled of expensive leather and cold air. "Chloe Barnes?" he asked. His voice was polite, quiet, and carried no room for negotiation. Her mouth went dry. "Yes. Mr. Rossi requests your company." "I don't know a Mr. Rossi." She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "He says you shared a meal on Friday. He would like to return the favor." Her stomach dropped. The man on the bench. The blood. The $3,000 suit. "I'm working," Chloe said, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't leave." The man reached into his coat. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. But he didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet, extracted a crisp $100 bill, and placed it on the counter. Then another. Then 3 more. $500 sitting on the worn linoleum. "For your lost wages," he said smoothly. "My car is outside. Please, Miss Barnes. We don't want to make a scene in a place of learning." It wasn't a request. It was a politely worded kidnapping. Chloe looked at the money. She looked at Jimmy, who was currently finding a spot on the far wall very interesting. She looked at the eviction notice folded in her pocket. "Let me get my coat," she said. Outside, a black SUV sat idling at the curb, an illegal parking spot that nobody was rushing to ticket. The man opened the rear door for her. She climbed in. The interior was pristine, smelling faintly of citrus and danger. The doors locked with a heavy, final thunk. They drove in silence for 20 minutes. The grey, crumbling streets of her neighborhood gave way to the sleek, towering glass of the financial district. They pulled up to a high-rise building that housed one of the city's most exclusive restaurants on its top floor, a place where an appetizer cost more than her weekly grocery budget. The men escorted her to the private elevator. They shot upward, her ears popping. When the doors slid open, there was no host. There were no other patrons. The sprawling, dimly lit restaurant was completely empty, save for a single table set by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Sitting at the table was the man from the bench, Gabriel Rossi. He looked different. The blood and the rain were gone. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top 2 buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms covered in intricate dark ink. The bruising on his jaw was turning a sickly yellow, and he moved with a slight stiffness. But the exhaustion was gone. He was terrifyingly vital. He exuded a quiet, heavy authority that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He stood up as she approached. It was a polite gesture that felt entirely out of place. "Miss Barnes," he said. The gravel and smoke were still in his voice. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't exactly given a multiple-choice test," Chloe replied, crossing her arms over her cheap cardigan. She refused to let him see her hands shaking. A corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Have a seat." She sat across from him. The chair was velvet. The silverware was heavy. She felt incredibly large, clumsy, and poor. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her curves, acutely aware of how she looked in this pristine environment. "You look nervous," he observed, pouring a clear liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. "I'm sitting with a man who sends goons to libraries and bleeds on park benches. I think my nerves are appropriately calibrated." He pushed a glass toward her. "Water, not alcohol." "They aren't goons, they're associates, and I bleed just like anyone else when someone slides 3 inches of steel between my ribs." "Who are you?" she asked flatly. He leaned back, resting his hands on his stomach. "My name is Gabriel Rossi. I handle logistics for several private entities in the city." "Logistics? Waste management, real estate, import, export." He watched her carefully. Chloe knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name Rossi. It was whispered when a rival business burned down. It was stamped on the side of the concrete trucks that poured the foundations of the new casinos. Mafia, Organized crime. The real, ugly deal. She swallowed hard. Okay. You're the mob. You're alive. You're welcome for the sandwich. Can I go home now? Gabriel's grey eyes locked onto hers. No. The word hit the table like a lead weight. You saved my life, Chloe. He said her name smoothly, turning it over on his tongue. I was bleeding out. My phone was gone. My men were 20 minutes out. If I had passed out on that bench in that cold, I would have died of shock before they found me. You kept me awake. You gave me calories. You gave me time. It was pastrami. It was a debt, he corrected, his voice hardening. I don't owe debts. I pay what I owe. Always. He reached into his pocket and placed a manila folder on the table. He slid it across the smooth wood toward her. Open it, he commanded softly. Chloe hesitated, then opened the cover. Inside was a stack of papers. The first was a copy of her eviction notice, but stamped diagonally across it in red ink was the word paid. Accompanying it was a lease agreement, her name on it, showing the rent paid in full for the next 5 years. She flipped to the next page. It was a bank statement, her student loan account. The balance, which had haunted her nightmares for 4 years, read $0. Her breath caught in her throat. The room spun slightly. How did you? I have resources, he said simply. She flipped to the final page. It was a deed of sale for the commercial property on 4th and Main. The library. The purchaser was listed as the Rossi Foundation. Attached was a memo from the City Council guaranteeing full funding and staff retention for the next decade. She looked up at him. Her vision was blurry. The sheer weight of what was in this folder, the erasure of every terror that kept her awake at night, was suffocating. Why? She choked out. This is millions of dollars. For a sandwich? For a life, Gabriel said, leaning forward. The polite facade slipped, revealing the predator beneath. You had nothing. I know exactly how much was in your account, Chloe. I know you walk in boots with holes in them. I know you hide your body in sweaters that are too big because you think you take up too much space in a world that doesn't want you. She flinched. The words were a physical blow. And yet, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble, you gave me your last meal. In a world full of parasites, you gave. You didn't ask for my watch. You didn't run. You are an anomaly. Chloe pushed the folder back toward him. Her hands were trembling violently now. I can't accept this. This is dirty money. Blood money. I'm not tying myself to a criminal. Gabriel didn't touch the folder. He just watched her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. You already are tied to me, Chloe, he said softly. The men who put that knife in me. They saw you. They saw you help me. They know who you are now. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. The cold reality of his words washed over her like ice water. I paid your debts, Chloe, Gabriel Rossi said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. Because now you belong to me. You need protection. I need a woman who doesn't flinch at the sight of my blood. We're going to be spending a lot of time together. He walked around the table, stopping just behind her chair. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. Eat your lunch, Miss Barnes. We have a lot of work to do. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes. They crossed the city limits, leaving the concrete grid for winding roads flanked by dense, skeletal winter trees. The car was a tomb. Gabriel sat next to her, staring out the window. The ambient glow of the dashboard caught the sharp angle of his jaw and the slight tightening of his muscles every time the SUV hit a pothole. They pulled up to a set of wrought-iron gates that swung open silently. The property wasn't a mansion. It was a fortress masquerading as modern architecture. Severe lines of slate and glass stood brutally against the dark hillside. The front door opened before they reached the steps. A man stood in the threshold. He looked like Gabriel, but rougher, as if he'd been chiseled out of cheaper stone. He wore a holster over a plain grey t-shirt. "You brought her here," the man said. It wasn't a question. He didn't move out of the doorway. "Dominic," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded immediate obedience. "Move!" Dominic stepped aside, his eyes raking over Chloe. They lingered on her fraying hem, the scuffed toes of her boots, and the way her oversized sweater clung awkwardly to her hips. He didn't hide his sneer. "This is the stray you traded a city block for?" Dominic asked. "She looks like she's going to faint on the rug." "Don't bleed on the rugs, sweetheart. They're imported." She stopped in the foyer. The floor was black marble. It felt like standing on a frozen lake. She looked at Dominic, letting the sheer absurdity of the last 6 hours crystallize into something sharp and solid in her chest. "I don't bleed unless someone stabs me," Chloe said flatly, which apparently is a habit your boss has yet to break. Dominic's jaw clicked. He took a half-step forward. Gabriel's arm shot out, a rigid bar of muscle pressing against his brother's chest. "Enough," Gabriel said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the cavernous hallway. "Chloe is under my protection. She is a guest in this house. You will treat her with the exact level of respect you afford me. If you fail to do that, I will break your jaw and wire it shut myself." Dominic stared at Gabriel, reading the absolute lack of bluff in his brother's eyes. He gave a jerky nod, cast one last venomous look at Chloe, and disappeared down a side corridor. "He's charming," she muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. The house was immaculate, beautiful, and freezing. "He's paranoid," Gabriel corrected, shrugging off his overcoat. He handed it to an older woman who had appeared silently from the shadows. "And he's right to be. The men who hit me are part of the Costa syndicate. They are messy, they are desperate, and they saw your face. Until I dismantle them, you stay here." He gestured for her to follow him. He led her up a floating glass staircase to a room at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open. It was the size of her entire apartment. A massive bed with stark white linens dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a dark, rolling lawn. There was a sitting area, a massive television, and a bathroom that smelled of eucalyptus and expensive stone. "Sleep," Gabriel commanded. "Someone will bring you clothes in the morning. We will discuss the logistics of your new routine tomorrow." He turned to leave. "Gabriel," she said. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I appreciate the theatrics," Chloe said, her voice shaking just a fraction. "I appreciate the paid debts. But I am not a pet. I'm not a hostage you can lock in a glass box." He turned fully around, leaning against the doorframe. His grey eyes swept over her. "You are alive. For now, that is the only metric of success I care about." He closed the door. She heard the distinct, heavy click of a lock turning from the outside. Chloe didn't sleep. She paced. She catalogued the room. She noted the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand. She checked the windows, locked, alarmed, and likely shatterproof. She was 26 years old, debt-free, and imprisoned in a multi-million-dollar compound. Around 3 a.m., the adrenaline finally burned out, leaving a hollow, gnawing hunger in its wake. She hadn't eaten since the diner shift on Sunday. She walked to the door and grabbed the handle. It didn't turn. She rattled it. "Hey," she said, knocking on the heavy wood. "Hey." Nothing. She stepped back, grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the bedside table, and walked back to the door. She didn't think about it. If she thought about it, the sheer terror of what she was doing would paralyze her. She swung the base of the lamp directly into the wooden paneling next to the lock. The wood cracked, a splintering, satisfying sound. She swung again. The door violently swung inward. A man in a dark suit stood there, his hand resting on a holstered weapon, staring at her in disbelief. "I'm hungry," Chloe said, lowering the lamp. "Where's the kitchen?" He blinked, clearly entirely unprepared for a hostage demanding a midnight snack with a blunt instrument. Before he could speak, Gabriel materialized from the shadows of the hallway. He was wearing grey sweatpants and a black t-shirt, his hair ruffled. He looked at the cracked door frame, the lamp in her hand, and then at her. "Stand down, Paul," Gabriel said to the guard, rubbing his temple. He looked back at Chloe. "Are you trying to break out, or just destroy the woodwork?" "I'm starving," she said, her voice steady, despite the hammering in her chest. "You kidnapped me before dinner. If I'm going to be a prisoner, I demand basic human rights. Point me to the refrigerator." Gabriel stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then, a low rumble started in his chest. It took her a second to realize he was laughing. It was a dark, rusty sound. "Come with me, Chloe," he said. He led her downstairs to a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a Michelin-starred restaurant. Industrial steel, dark marble, and gleaming appliances. He opened a massive refrigerator and stepped back. She ignored the caviar and the imported cheeses. She found leftover roasted chicken, some sharp cheddar, and half a loaf of sourdough. She moved to the counter, entirely ignoring him as she assembled a sandwich. She pulled open a drawer, looking for a knife to cut the bread. Her hand wrapped around the handle of a Wüsthof chef's knife. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, sharp enough to shave with. She held it for a second longer than necessary. She didn't cut the bread. She just held the steel, feeling its weight. Gabriel's hand covered hers. His skin was hot against her freezing knuckles. He didn't pry the knife away. He just wrapped his large hand over her grip, pressing down slightly. "It's an 8-inch blade," Gabriel murmured, his voice right next to her ear. "Good for slicing, terrible for stabbing. It will slip on the rib bone, and you'll slice your own fingers off on the heel." She swallowed hard, looking down at their joined hands. "Good to know. If you want to carry a weapon in my house, Chloe, just ask. I'll give you one that actually works." He gently squeezed her hand, then let go, stepping back. "Make your sandwich. Then go back to sleep. The door will remain unlocked." Tuesday morning, Chloe sat at the massive oak dining table, drinking coffee that tasted like roasted heaven. Gabriel sat at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of heavily redacted documents. "I'm going to work," she announced. He didn't look up. "No, you aren't. You bought the library, Gabriel. You funded it. If I don't show up, Mrs. Higgins will panic, Davis will hyperventilate, and I will lose my mind sitting in this glass museum. The Costa family is actively looking for you. Then send a guard. Send 2. But I am going to work." She set her mug down with a sharp clatter. "You paid my debts. You didn't buy my autonomy. If I stay in this house, staring at these walls, I will become a victim. I don't do victims." Gabriel finally looked up. He studied her face, passing the stubborn set of her jaw. She wasn't wearing her oversized cardigan today. One of his people had procured clothes, a pair of dark tailored trousers and a fitted cashmere sweater that actually hugged the curves she usually tried to hide. She felt exposed, but she refused to shrink under his gaze. "Tommy goes with you," Gabriel said finally. "He drives you. He sits by the door. He walks you to the bathroom. If he says move, you move. If you argue with him, I will drag you back here and lock you in the basement. Are we clear?" Crystal. An hour later, Chloe was standing behind the circulation desk at the 4th and Main Public Library. Tommy, a man built like a commercial refrigerator wearing a tailored suit, sat near the front entrance, reading a copy of Goodnight Moon with intense concentration. The morning was beautifully, excruciatingly normal. She scanned returns. She helped a college student find periodicals on medieval agriculture. She fixed a paper jam in the copier. For 3 hours, the Mafia didn't exist. Around 1 p.m., the lunch rush began. People seeking refuge from the cold. She was shelving a stack of hardcovers in the history section, 3 aisles away from the main desk. The library was quiet, a hushed murmur of rustling paper and clicking keyboards. Then she heard a boot scrape against the linoleum. It was a small sound. Ordinarily she wouldn't have noticed, but living with Gabriel Rossi for 3 days had recalibrated her nervous system. She peeked through the gap between a biography on Churchill and a thick volume on the Roman Empire. A man was walking down the aisle. He wore a heavy green parka and a worn beanie. He looked like half the patrons who came in to escape the wind, but his shoes were wrong. He was wearing matte black combat boots, impeccably clean, laced tightly, and his hands were entirely bare, knuckles scarred, resting casually inside his deep coat pockets. He wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at the ends of the aisles, tracking the layout. Searching. Her blood turned to ice water. She looked toward the front of the library. She couldn't see Tommy. The shelving blocked her line of sight. The man paused at the end of her aisle. He turned his head slowly. He saw her cart. He saw her. He didn't smile. He just pulled his right hand out of his pocket. A suppressed pistol, matte black and ugly, was gripped in his hand. He raised it. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Instinct, raw and ugly, took over. Chloe shoved the heavy metal book cart directly at him with all her strength. The cart slammed into his shins just as the gun coughed, a quiet thwip sound. A hardcover biography behind her exploded in a cloud of shredded paper and dust. The man stumbled, cursing. She didn't wait to see if he fell. She sprinted down the opposite end of the aisle, darting into the dense, maze-like layout of the reference section. "Tommy!" Chloe screamed. The sound tore through the quiet library like a siren. Panic erupted. Chairs scraped. People shouted. She ducked behind a massive oak table just as another suppressed shot hit a computer monitor, shattering glass across the carpet. She crawled, scraping her knees, moving toward the basement access door, the archives. It was a labyrinth of sliding steel shelves. If she could get down there, he'd never find her. Footsteps pounded behind her. Heavy, measured. She reached the heavy fire door, yanked it open, and threw herself down the concrete stairs. She hit the landing hard, tearing the knee of her trousers and scraping her skin raw, but she scrambled up and slammed the basement door shut, engaging the heavy deadbolt. Seconds later, the handle rattled violently. Then, the heavy thud of a shoulder hitting the metal. Chloe backed away into the darkness of the archives. The air smelled of dust and old paper. The only light came from the small emergency exit sign at the far end of the room. She reached into the deep pocket of her trousers. Her fingers closed around the smooth, heavy handle of the paring knife she had slipped from Gabriel's kitchen that morning. 3 inches of steel. Good for slicing. The metal door at the top of the stairs groaned, then gave way with a deafening crash. The locking mechanism shattered. Heavy boots descended the concrete stairs, slowly, deliberately. She backed into the narrow gap between 2 motorized shelving units. She held her breath. She held the knife. She mapped the anatomy of a human body in her head. Neck, thigh, under the arm. The man stepped into the basement. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator. "Come out, librarian," he whispered. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Rossi isn't here to save you." He walked past her aisle. She saw his silhouette against the faint red glow of the exit sign. He was looking straight ahead. He took one more step. She didn't think. She lunged out of the darkness. She didn't aim for his ribs. She remembered Gabriel's warning. She swung her arm in a vicious, downward arc, driving the small paring knife directly into the meat of his shoulder, right where the neck meets the collarbone. The man roared, a sound of pure shock. He swung around wildly, his elbow catching Chloe squarely in the jaw. The world flashed white. She was thrown backward, crashing into the metal shelves. The air rushed out of her lungs. The knife was gone, still stuck in his shoulder. He staggered, clutching his neck, blood pouring down his parka. He raised the gun, pointing it unsteadily at her chest. She closed her eyes. A deafening roar shattered the basement. It wasn't a suppressed weapon. It was raw, unbridled gunfire. The man in the parka jerked violently forward, then collapsed, hitting the concrete floor like a sack of wet cement. Chloe opened her eyes, gasping for air. Tommy stood at the bottom of the stairs, a massive handgun smoking in his grip. He looked down at the body, then stepped over it, rushing toward her. "Miss Barnes," Tommy said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual calm. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch. "Are you hit? Are you bleeding?" "No," Chloe croaked, tasting copper in her mouth. Her jaw throbbed with a vicious intensity. She pointed a trembling finger at the dead man on the floor. The handle of her paring knife was sticking out of his shoulder. "I stabbed him." Tommy looked at the knife, then back at her. A bizarre mix of horror and profound respect washed over his wide face. "Yeah," Tommy breathed. "You sure did." The master bathroom in Gabriel's suite was quiet, save for the sound of running water. Chloe sat on the edge of the massive marble vanity, staring blankly at the wall. Gabriel stood between her knees. He held a piece of sterile gauze soaked in iodine. He hadn't spoken since he tore through the library doors 20 minutes after Tommy called him. He hadn't yelled. He had simply walked into the basement, looked at the body, looked at her, and picked her up off the floor as if she weighed nothing. Now, his face was a mask of cold, terrifying stillness. He dabbed the iodine against the scrape on her cheekbone. It burned like fire. She flinched, sucking in a sharp breath through her teeth. "Hold still," he murmured. His voice was incredibly soft. It was the softness of a wire pulled just before it snaps. He moved down, inspecting the heavy purple bruise blooming along her jawline where the hitman had struck her. His thumb traced the edge of the discoloration. His touch was painfully gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence that clung to him. "I told you," Gabriel said, his eyes finally meeting hers in the mirror. They were a stormy, dangerous grey. "I told you they were looking for you." "I know," she whispered. "You brought a paring knife to a gunfight, Chloe." "It worked," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. The reality of the dead man on the basement floor was settling heavily into her bones, a cold weight that made her hands shake. Gabriel dropped the bloody gauze into the sink. He didn't step back. He stayed between her knees, leaning in closer. His hands gripped the edge of the marble counter on either side of her hips, trapping her. "It shouldn't have worked," he said. His breathing was uneven now. The mask was cracking. He was a professional. He should have put a bullet in your head before you ever cleared the aisle. "Do you understand how close you came to dying today?" "I've been dying by degrees my whole life, Gabriel," she snapped back, a sudden surge of anger cutting through the shock. I've been drowning in debt, starving in a freezing apartment, waiting for the floor to fall out. Today wasn't new, it was just louder." Gabriel stared at her. The harsh bathroom light caught the jagged scar through his eyebrow, the slight crook of his nose. He wasn't handsome in a conventional, polished way. He looked like a man who had been broken and put back together with steel joints. "I bought the library," he said slowly, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I paid the debts. I put you in a fortress. I tried to fix the floor." "You can't buy my safety," Chloe said, her hands curling into fists against her thighs. "You can't lock me away. If I'm going to survive in this world you pulled me into, I have to be a part of it. I'm not playing the damsel. I refuse." He looked at her face, at the bruise, at the fire in her eyes. The anger in his expression slowly morphed into something else. Something heavy, hot, and infinitely more dangerous. "You stabbed a Costa enforcer in the neck with a piece of kitchen cutlery," he murmured, almost to himself. 3 inches of steel, she reminded him, her voice breathless as he leaned in closer. "Good for slicing." Gabriel let out a ragged breath. He moved his hands from the counter, bringing them up to frame her face. His palms were rough, calloused from years of violence, but they held her like she was made of spun glass. "You are a goddamn menace, Chloe Barnes," he whispered. "I'm a librarian," she corrected. He didn't laugh this time. He just looked at her, really looked at her. He didn't look past the curves she hid, or the sharp, cynical edges of her personality. He looked at all of it, and she saw a hunger in his eyes that had absolutely nothing to do with food. "I kept you because you gave me half a sandwich when I was bleeding out," Gabriel said, his thumb tracing her jawline. "I paid your debts because I owed you. But I am keeping you here, in this house, because you are the only real thing I have ever encountered in my miserable, violent life." He closed the distance. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like iodine and adrenaline. She didn't push him away. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt, pulling him harder against her, meeting his violence with an urgency she didn't know she possessed. They were both broken, shaped by cold cities and colder realities. But in that bathroom, surrounded by marble and the lingering scent of gunpowder, Chloe finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. She claimed it. The adrenaline crash hit at 2 in the morning. Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the massive rug in Gabriel's bedroom, wearing one of his oversized black t-shirts. The smell of copper and iodine still lingered on her skin, layered under the sharp, clean scent of his soap. Gabriel sat at a heavy mahogany desk in the corner. A single desk lamp cast a harsh, yellow circle over a sprawl of architectural blueprints and printed dossiers. He held a phone to his ear. He hadn't slept. He hadn't stopped moving since they left the library. "I don't care if they're holding up in the industrial district," Gabriel said into the receiver. His voice was a flat, dead calm that terrified her more than his anger. "Cut the power to the block. Bribe the night shift supervisor at the grid station. If the Costas want to operate in the dark, let them freeze." He hung up. He leaned back in the leather chair and pinched the bridge of his nose. Chloe pulled her knees to her chest. "You're going to war." Gabriel opened his eyes. In the dim light, they looked entirely black. "They broke the truce the second they walked into a public building and fired a weapon. They targeted you. It's not a war, Chloe. It's an extermination. Dominic said they're desperate." "They are." Gabriel stood up and walked over to the bed. He sat on the edge, the mattress barely dipping under his weight. "Old man Costa died 3 months ago. His son, Leo, took over. Leo is a rabid dog. He doesn't understand logistics. He doesn't understand restraint. He's bleeding cash, and he wants my ports to stop the hemorrhaging. She looked at the files scattered across his desk. How does a family that sloppy stay in power? Because they pay the right people, Gabriel said bitterly. Leo Costa isn't smart, but he inherited his father's payroll. Half the precinct captains in the South Ward look the other way. The DA loses evidence. They have a judicial shield. We can shoot his enforcers all day, but until we break his shield, Leo will just buy more guns. Chloe thought about the man in the library, the casual way he had drawn a weapon in a room full of people. He didn't fear the police. He didn't fear the consequences. She stood up. The cold hardwood floor bit into the soles of her bare feet. She walked over to the desk and looked at the top file. It was a list of names: politicians, judges, police lieutenants. You know who is on the payroll, she said, tracing a finger over a name. Judge Thomas Caldwell. She recognized the name. He was the judge who had signed off on the accelerated eviction notices for her apartment building, allowing a shell corporation to push out low-income tenants without proper notice. Knowing and proving are two different things, Gabriel said. He walked up behind her. She could feel the heat radiating off his chest. I'm a known criminal, Chloe. I can't walk into the FBI field office with a handwritten list. And if I just start assassinating judges, the National Guard will be rolling down Main Street by Friday. You don't need a bullet to kill a judge, she said. Her mind was already racing, categorizing, sorting. You need a paper trail. If Leo Costa is bleeding cash, he's moving it. Shell companies, offshore accounts, real estate holdings. My accountants have been trying to pierce their corporate veil for 6 months. The Costas use a labyrinth of blind trusts. Chloe turned around. She bumped into his chest, but she didn't step back. She looked up at him. Gabriel, I have spent the last 4 years helping panicked law students find obscure precedents from 1972 on microfilm. I tracked down out-of-print, self-published genealogies for retirees. I know how to navigate public records, municipal tax codes, and property deeds better than anyone in this city. He looked down at her, a slow furrow forming between his brows. You're a librarian. Yes, she said, poking him hard in the center of his chest. I manage information. I find things people want to keep hidden. If Judge Caldwell is getting paid, he's spending it. If Leo Costa is paying him, the money exists somewhere in a ledger. Give me your accountant's files. Give me a laptop with a secure VPN. Give me access to the county clerk's digital archive. Gabriel stared at her. He looked at her bruised jaw, the fierce set of her shoulders, and the absolute refusal in her eyes to be sent back to the sidelines. He didn't argue. He walked to the door, opened it, and yelled down the hallway, "Dominic, get in here!" 2 minutes later, Dominic appeared. He looked at her, standing in his brother's t-shirt, and sneered. What? Get Paul to set up a secure terminal in the study, Gabriel ordered. Bring all the financial boxes we pulled from the Costa raids last year. Everything. The ledgers, the tax returns, the property deeds. Dominic scoffed. Why? The accountant said it was just noise. The accountants don't know how to look, Gabriel said. He turned and looked at Chloe. The corner of his mouth twitched into a dangerous, proud smirk. Miss Barnes is going to do some reading. The study smelled of stale coffee, ozone from the humming servers, and dry, aging paper. It was Thursday morning. She hadn't seen the sun in 2 days. Chloe sat at a sprawling oak table covered in stacks of manila folders, tax records, and property deeds. 4 empty mugs stained with coffee rings sat to her left. Her eyes burned, feeling like they were coated in sand. Dominic stood by the window, cleaning a handgun with aggressive, rhythmic strokes of an oiled cloth. He had been assigned to watch her. She thought Gabriel did it to punish him. You're wasting your time, Dominic muttered, not looking up from the slide of his weapon. Leo Costa operates in cash. He hands envelopes to Caldwell in dark parking lots. There is no trail. Nobody operates strictly in cash anymore, Dominic, Chloe said, rubbing her temples. Cash is heavy. It's suspicious. If Judge Caldwell is suddenly buying a $2 million vacation home in Aspen on a civil servant's salary, the IRS asks questions. So he hides it. Exactly, he hides it. She pulled a thick stack of stapled papers toward her. He hides it in a shell company, say, Apex Holdings. And Apex Holdings is funded by an anonymous LLC registered in Delaware. And that LLC receives a monthly retainer for consulting fees from a sanitation company. Dominic stopped wiping the gun. He looked up. And, she continued, pulling a faded, yellowed carbon copy of a business license from a different pile. If you cross-reference the sanitation company's registered address, it's a vacant lot in the South Ward. A lot owned by... Wait for it. She typed a sequence into the county property database on the laptop. She hit enter. The screen loaded. A lot owned by Maria Costa, Leo's mother. Chloe leaned back in her chair, a vicious, feral satisfaction blooming in her chest. They didn't use a blind trust for the initial land purchase 20 years ago. They just changed the names on the holding companies, but the parcel ID number never changed. The study door swung open. Gabriel walked in. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and an expression carved from granite. He smelled of cold air and gasoline. Tell me you have something, Chloe. Leo just hit one of our warehouses on the docks. We lost 3 men. She didn't hesitate. She spun the laptop around so it faced him. She stacked 3 folders neatly in front of the screen. I have Judge Caldwell. I have Police Captain Reynolds. I have 2 city councilmen, she said, her voice crisp and entirely devoid of fatigue. I have the deed transfers, the routing numbers for the offshore accounts, and the falsified tax returns matching the exact amounts Leo Costa's sanitation front claimed as losses. Gabriel looked at the screen. He read the summary she had typed up. He picked up the property deed and looked at the highlighted parcel ID. The silence in the room was absolute. Gabriel looked up. He looked at Dominic. Call the federal prosecutor's office, the one we bought last year. Tell him we are hand-delivering a sealed indictment with evidence. Tell him if he signs off on the arrest warrants by noon, he gets to be the hero who took down the Costa syndicate. Dominic stared at the folders on the table. He looked at Chloe, really looked at her, for the first time since she stepped into the house. The sneer was gone. It was replaced by a slow, calculating respect. He nodded once, sharply, and pulled out his phone. Gabriel walked around the table. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. His fingers squeezed, a silent transmission of gratitude and awe. Get dressed, Gabriel said quietly. We're going for a ride. An hour later, she was sitting in the back of the black SUV. Gabriel sat beside her, an AR-15 resting casually across his knees. Tommy was driving. 2 more SUVs trailed behind them. They weren't going to the docks. They were going to the financial district. They pulled up across the street from the county courthouse. It was a massive building of white marble and imposing columns. Watch, Gabriel said. 10 minutes passed. Then a fleet of black sedans swarmed the courthouse steps. Men and women in dark windbreakers with yellow FBI lettering poured out of the vehicles. They bypassed the metal detectors. A few moments later, they re-emerged. In the center of the federal agents was Judge Thomas Caldwell. He was wearing his black robes. His hands were cuffed behind his back. His face was a mask of pale, sweating terror. News vans were already screeching to a halt at the curb, reporters shoving microphones into the faces of the agents. Chloe watched the man who had signed the paper to throw her out onto the street, the man who protected murderers, get shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. It wasn't a gunshot. It was systematic, Absolute destruction. It was hard karma, delivered on paper. Gabriel's phone buzzed. He answered it on speaker. "The warrants hit the precinct." Dominic's voice crackled through the speaker. "Reynolds is in custody. The Costa payroll is frozen. The feds raided Leo's sanitation front." "Where is Leo?" Gabriel asked. "He panicked," Dominic said, a cruel amusement in his voice. "He tried to run to his private airstrip. We intercepted him on the highway." "Casualties?" "None of ours. Leo's car took a bad roll. He didn't make it out." Gabriel hung up the phone. He looked out the window at the courthouse, at the chaos unfolding on the marble steps. The Costa family was gone. Dismantled in an afternoon, not by a gang war, but by a broke librarian who knew how to read a ledger. Gabriel turned to Chloe. He unclipped the magazine from his rifle and set the weapon on the floorboard. He reached out and cupped her face. His thumb brushed over the fading bruise on her jaw. "You terrified them, Chloe," he murmured. "You took away their armor." "They deserved it," she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't feel guilt. She felt the deep, settling warmth of a fractured world righting itself. They preyed on people who couldn't fight back. Now they know what it feels like. Gabriel leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, claiming, and deeply grounded. It tasted like victory. 6 months later. The heat in the library was working perfectly. It hummed a quiet, steady rhythm beneath the floorboards. The smell of decaying glue was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine cleaner and new binding. Chloe stood behind the circulation desk, running a scanner over a stack of graphic novels. "Miss Barnes?" She looked up. A young teenager wearing a frayed backpack and a nervous expression stood at the counter. "Hi, David. Did you finish the sci-fi series?" she asked, smiling. "Yeah, it was awesome. I have a problem, though." He shifted his weight, looking down at his worn sneakers. "My mum's shift got cut at the diner. The landlord says if we don't have rent by Friday, he's changing the locks." Chloe stopped scanning. She looked at David. She saw the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. She remembered that exact exhaustion. "What's your landlord's name, David?" she asked, pulling a heavy black notebook from beneath the counter. "Mr. Peterson. He owns the brick building on 6th. She opened the notebook and uncapped a pen. "Let me make a phone call. I know some people in city housing. We'll get it sorted out. You aren't getting locked out on Friday." David let out a breath he looked like he'd been holding for a week. "Thank you, Miss Barnes." He walked away, heading toward the computer lab. She picked up the landline and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice. "Logistics," a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Gabriel," she said, leaning her elbows on the counter. "I need a favor. We have a slumlord on 6th named Peterson. He's trying to illegally evict a family." She heard the sound of a heavy chair creaking through the receiver. "Peterson," Gabriel mused. "I know him. Runs a few illegal poker games out of the basement of that building. Dominic has been looking for an excuse to shut them down." "Don't break his legs," she warned, though she couldn't stop the small, cynical smile pulling at her lips. "I'm a legitimate businessman, Chloe. I don't break legs," Gabriel said smoothly. "I will simply have Dominic explain the intricacies of the tenant protection laws to him, very clearly, up close. Thank you. Are you coming home for dinner? Paul is making the roasted chicken." "I get off at 6. Tommy is already parked outside, glaring at the meter maid." Gabriel chuckled, a warm, rusty sound that still sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll see you at home, sweetheart." Chloe hung up the phone. She looked around the library. The new computers gleamed. The reference section was fully stocked. Mrs. Higgins was sitting in a plush leather armchair by the window, reading a mystery novel in peace. The city was still rough. It was still loud and unforgiving, but they had carved out a sanctuary in the middle of it. She wasn't just a broke librarian anymore. She didn't hide in oversized cardigans, apologizing for taking up space. She wore tailored blouses and walked with the quiet assurance of a woman who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried and who held the shovel. Gabriel Rossi ran the underground. He controlled the ports, the concrete, and the shadows. But she controlled the information. She controlled the paper trail. They were a balance of brutal force and calculated precision. He protected her library. She protected his empire from the kind of corruption that bullets couldn't fix. The heavy glass doors opened. The afternoon sun caught the brass handles. Jimmy, the security guard, gave a polite nod as a man walked in. He didn't wear a $3,000 suit today. He wore dark jeans, a fitted black Henley that showed the ink on his forearms, and a leather jacket. The jagged scar through his eyebrow caught the overhead light. Gabriel ignored the stacks. He ignored the patrons. He walked straight to the circulation desk. He moved with that same heavy, quiet authority. The apex predator in a room full of prey. He stopped in front of her. He didn't speak. He just reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small, silver foil-wrapped package, and placed it on the counter between them. Chloe raised an eyebrow. She reached out and unwrapped the foil. It was half a pastrami sandwich on rye bread. She looked up at him. His grey eyes were entirely soft, holding a private amusement that belonged only to them. "You owed me half a sandwich, Rossi," she said, picking up the bread. "This took you 6 months." "I had to find the right deli," Gabriel said, leaning across the counter. He invaded her space, smelling of expensive leather and home. "And I don't owe debts, Chloe. I pay what I owe. Always." She took a bite. It was significantly better than the one she had given him in the rain. She chewed, swallowed, and grabbed the lapels of his leather jacket, pulling him across the circulation desk. She kissed him hard and deep, tasting mustard and rye and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. They had built an empire on blood and books, and she wasn't going anywhere. Chloe didn't just survive the mafia. She audited it. She took a crumbling life and rebuilt it with steel and ledger books, proving that the most dangerous weapon in a crime syndicate isn't a gun. It's a librarian with a secure VPN. Did you love seeing Chloe tear down the corrupt elite and claim her place beside Gabriel? If you want more gritty, grounded romance, where the heroine fights back with her brain instead of waiting to be saved, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a ruthless power couple, and subscribe to the channel for more original audio stories. Comment below, would you have figured out the Costa family's paper trail?